Since 1995, over 26,000 international students from all walks of life join the British investigators' training courses in anomalous phenomena, the only courses of their kind. Constructed by the world's leading academics and brilliant minds within ufology, paranormal and supernatural, parapsychological study, anomalous phenomena, science, hypnotherapy, spiritualism, astrology, astronomy, cryptozoology, and many other areas, our certified self-study courses will teach you how to assess, analyze, engage, formulate, document, and be cognizant of all types of phenomena, suitable for light workers and starseeds, curious personalities and inquisitive minds, skeptics alike and truth seekers. For more information, please visit www.stellaruniversity.com.
Then, in October of 1973, I'm dating myself, I know, I was 18, I was up in the mountains of North Carolina, and I was sitting up by a fire tower up on Rich's Mountain at about 5,000 and some feet up in the Blue Ridge, and I was in deep meditation, and suddenly, after the meditation, I realized I wasn't alone. And there was I thought it was a deer that had beautiful almond-shaped eyes that was standing on its legs. I was an 18-year-old kid. I didn't know what this was. But it was an extraterrestrial life form. It touched me on my right shoulder, and all of my hair stood on end. Sort of like, you know, and that's when I had a lot of hair. And it was this beautiful experience. And with that, I sort of like shifted out of space-time with this being in space with them. And it was in space. It was beautiful. And so began the experience of me using consciousness to make contact with these interstellar beings. And I began to experiment with it. So here I am, I'm an 18-year-old college student, and I'm experimenting with this, and every night that I do it, the National Park Service rangers and people are reporting UFOs being seen all over the area, and this big wave of UFOs start. And I realized that this really works, that you can go into quiet mind, remote view these civilizations wherever they are, using consciousness to see, set up a vector, like a landing vector if you're flying into LAX, that we do electronically, but you do this with thought, show them where we are, and ask them if they're able to come and interact with us. Now, they're not puppets on a string, but more often than not, something will happen. And so I didn't know what to do with this. I'm 18 years old, and I go, well, this is all very interesting, but kind of strange. And then I go on doing other things. And in 1990, I was basically visited and asked to start this entire effort, the CE5, Close Encounters of the Fifth Kind initiative. And the reason for it was that I later learned that there were a group of world leaders in November of 1989, including Papa Bush and Perez de Cuellar and a whole bunch of people who wanted to end the secrecy on this subject, but not in a way that was very conscious. And as an sort of result of this, and then the aftermath of it, something happened that shut that down. And when I had the meeting some years ago with Prince Hans-Adam von Liechtenstein, who's the Crown Prince of Liechtenstein, prior to a meeting with him, he had sent me a letter and said, Dr. Greer, you won't be able to do disclosure or contact, but not for reasons you think. I said, what? But I don't want to talk about it. I talked to him on the phone at his castle, but he says, well, I'm going to come to New York, let's meet. So we met. And what I discovered was that he and the other people who had been planning this in 1989, now remember this is over 25 years ago, didn't know that within the unacknowledged special access projects, which are the super secret projects that deal with this subject, not just in the US, but in Great Britain, Australia, all over. There's representation in every country, China, Russia. it's sort of its own transnational entity that kind of runs sub rosa and beneath the radar of normal governments. That there was a compartment at operation that had been practicing and had perfected the stagecraft of hoaxing contact. Now, this is the part of the story that people do not like for me to tell, but you need to know it, and it's controversial, but it's essential if you're going to become someone who has clarity on this subject. Beginning in the late 40s and 50s, experiments began with electronic systems that led to the ability to alter awareness, but also to create life forms that look like aliens but are not. These are called program life forms. And by 1954, October, we had perfected electromagnetogravitics. What am I talking about? High voltage systems with certain resonant fields and certain specialized materials that allow for us to have lift. A UFO, man-made. So man-made UFOs, which began to be experimented with Wernher von Braun and others for Adolf Hitler in the 40s, the OSS, that became the CIA, through Operation Paperclip, brought those folks into our intelligence community and into our early aerospace program and created a whole parallel secret space program that did not involve rockets. So, I always tell people, if you're a rocket scientist, your knowledge is pretty much locked to 1940s. Everything that has been developed since then has been classified. Now, because of this, maybe we can turn off cell phones, thank you. Because of this, there became, as Eisenhower warned, a vast military-industrial complex that was so classified that eventually he lost control of it. And no president since Eisenhower has had operational control over all of these compartments. Now, by the time 1989 came around, there had been probably 100 generations of exponential development of those technologies. And as Ben Rich said, and as I'm sure you saw in the film, Sirius reported at a meeting that Jan Harzan from IBM was at that meeting, he's now the head of MUFON, that we basically had the technologies to take ET home. And that the way that communication happened is that it's like ESP, and every point in space and time is connected to every other point, which is, of course, what we've been saying for a long time. But the technologies that exist in these classified programs begin to be attached to an agenda to deceive people. Because here's what someone said to me in the early 90s as I was preparing to brief the director of the CIA. You hide it in plain sight. You hide everything in plain sight. It's all there. But you put a spin on it so that people are deceived. So it's either ridiculous or it's made to look kooky to keep it out of the mainstream media or academic circles, or it's something very frightening, so people don't want to approach it. They're terrified. And the added benefit of scaring people is that then you lay the foundation for what Wernher von Braun warned us about on his deathbed, that there was an agenda to stage an alien attack on Earth for the purpose of expanding the control of this military-industrial junta that is the biggest industry on the planet today, and seize more and more control through a false flag type operation like the Gulf of Tonkin in Vietnam, which, as you know, expanded the Vietnam War exponentially when we sort of hoaxed and staged the attack on our vessels in the Gulf of Tonkin in Vietnam. But this would be on a cosmic level. So beginning in the 50s and 60s, a plan was created to have events happen, controlled events, that would convince people that they were having experiences from ETs that were actually being done through what's called stagecraft from people. Now, Pérez de Cuellar didn't know this, the UN Secretary General, nor at that time did Papa Bush, the elder, not W, who was President of the United States in 1989, or Prince Hans Anna von Liechtenstein. But so what happened, and many of you may have heard of this through some of the work and research Bud Hopkins did, was that Pérez de Cuellar was abducted out of his limousine at 3 in the morning out of Midtown Manhattan. Of course, and he was told by the, quote, aliens to stop the disclosure effort, and that if he didn't, every world leader involved, including the President of the United States, would be abducted. And this blew up, I'm quoting from the Prince, like an atomic bomb in the Bush White House. The whole thing was shut down. Everything was shut down. So Gorbachev was involved, Papa Bush was involved, Pérez de Cuellar was involved, and Prince Hans Anna von Liechtenstein. Now, I asked the Prince how he knew about this event that happened to Pérez de Cuellar. He says, because I'm very good friends with him and I was involved in this operation and knew about it when it happened. So that's the true story. Now, what Prince didn't know is that it was staged. It was what's called stagecraft. And I have a document from the 90s from the SSI, an organization that deals with Strategic Studies Institute is what it's called. And it talks about staging and hoaxing UFO events and abductions, it says the word, and mutilations for the purpose of scaring people so that it would create the psychological foundation for conflict in the future between Earth, humans, and these other civilizations. Now, I know this sounds terribly Machiavellian, and it is, but you have to consider, as a Pentagon person told me once, God help us that peace would break out. Because, well, I mean, you know, we're spending almost $1 trillion a year in the United States on military, homeland security, intelligence, et cetera, and so on. So you've got to keep some fires burning. So the whole global terrorism thing that's been manipulated to allow to get out of control, frankly, is to keep that fire burning until they can hit the button on the false flag interstellar. And it would fool almost everyone on planet Earth unless we wake up. So it's like the song from the 1970s, The Who, we won't be fooled again. Well, I think we were fooled again. 9/11 happened and we invaded Iraq. What a disaster. Now we have ISIS. So it's time for childhood's end here. And I'm going into this stuff not to kind of like scare people or be controversial, but I think that you need to know the truth about these things before we go on to what it means to become an ambassador to these civilizations. Otherwise, you're going to be taking all manner of baggage into your contact effort when you're out under the stars with your friends. So let's jettison the baggage and the disinfo packet, the disinformation packet, so that we get clarity on what this is. I don't speak of these things just to sort of put down any other person's research. I think most people are trying to report out what they're finding, but they don't know what the originating source of the finding is. For example, they don't know that EG&G and prior to that Siemens were building the implants that were being put into the people being abducted. They think they're from an interstellar civilization, which they are not. So this information is very explosive. People hate it when I speak about it because people like to have someone to hate. Now let's talk about that. Why is it that humans always want to find someone that they can vent otherness onto? Well, for a long time, I grew up in the 50s and 60s in the South. It was black people. I still remember having black and white water fountains in the late 50s and early 60s in North Carolina, where my father worked at a Sears store. Shocking. Then we had to hate someone else, some other culture, some other religion, gay people, whatever it is. You make up somebody that you can vent all of your hatred on and feel that you're better than they are. And where does this come from? Where does this original sin, if there is one, it's this divisiveness, come from? Well, if you study chimpanzees and other primates, which I have done, what you find is that they do organize into troops and into war. and we are 98.5% identical to chimpanzees. So we have this proclivity that can be exploited by demagogues, whether it be religious demagogues, political demagogues, ufology demagogues, covert, majestic MJ-12, the group that was originally assembled to run the secret UFO programs, demagogues, to turn one people against another, or, like the movie Independence Day, turn an entire civilization against another civilization. Why? Because in that conflict and fear, they can amass more and more centralized power. It's all about control and power. So how do we, it's like that song from In Vogue, free your mind, you know, it's like, you know, remember that song? You got to free your mind, honey, because here's the problem. If you pull all that into your paradigm, what you're going to do is simply replace one enemy for another. And that's what they have always wanted us to do. They've always had at the ready the next level of conflict, the next level of enemy. And the big one is not in Iraq or Tehran, it's out there that they're wanting to concoct. So I think we have to be very careful that we are not manipulated into this stupidity. Because if we are, we're going to get into the biggest catastrophe in human history, much worse than World War II. And I will remind you that no less a figure than General Douglas MacArthur in the well of the Congress in the 1950s, when he was leaving his post, said World War III will be interplanetary. So this xenophobia and fear-mongering and what have you began to be hatched about the time I was born in the mid-50s, and before many of you were alive. So we have to understand that the ability for a group that has trillions of dollars at their disposal to falsely inform people and to manipulate in a propagandist way, much like Hitler did against Jews and gypsies and gay people and socialists or whoever it was, to justify the Holocaust, that psychological warfare propaganda was basically taken from the ashes of World War II and then reapplied to this subject, which pretty much explains most of what is known as retail ufology. And it's for this reason that, of course, I've always been the black sheep in that field. Because people do not, I mean, you know, it's like Gloria Steinem said, the truth will set you free, but first it will piss you off. So people, you know, always say, we just want to know the truth. And I'm going, well, I'm not so sure you do. But I'm going to share it anyway. Now, this is what I learned in the early 90s. I didn't know this until the early to mid 90s because I didn't have meetings with people who were read into, military speak is read into, or briefed at that level of compartmented intelligence, top secret SCI, special compartment intelligence. And I began to meet with not one. If I had heard this from one person, I would have dismissed it as crackpot. But I heard it from dozens. And then it began to make sense. But the problem is, there are people who've had contact, they get labeled an abductee, but they've had contact that was actually ET. And then you have people who have been targeted with what are called programmed life forms that are these robotic creatures. Everybody's seen the Stan Romanek tape of Boo, that little ET thing in the window? Well, there's one that Disney Studio bought up the rights for that no one has seen, but a few of us. I saw it in his kitchen. Of one of these PLFs breaking into his house through a canister. He passed out, the camera falls over, and it's this gray that looks like a robotic thing. And someone from the intelligence community who apparently knew his father, who was in the Air Force, kept calling him with a sound-modified, voice-modified, British-sounding woman's voice saying, Stan, it's one of the fake ones. It's one of the fake ones. It's one of the fake ones, over and over again. So when I got to Stan Romanek's house in Denver, he said, what does this mean, a fake one? I said, and there was a MUFON investigator there who was supposed to be an expert on abductions. And I went, well, this is the ones that are being made in the outback of Australia at Pine Gap and at Dulce. and at the Dugway Proving Grounds and underground bases, and they are nanobio machines. They're biologicals that are robotic and have integrated circuits in their neural cortex. They're man-made. And people looked at me like, what? I said, you don't know about that? It began to be written about by Martin Cannon in 1988. So this is old news, but somehow it never breaks its way onto the History Channel. It never seems to find its way onto the Discovery Channel. It's Alien Invasion Week on the History Channel, or in the UFO conferences, or on radio shows, where if you talk about this, you will be blacklisted, which I have been. So this is the deepest, darkest part of the secret of the UFO issue, that they have developed technologies that can masquerade as ET that aren't, that there are technologies, as Ben Rich correctly said, the head of the Lockheed super secret skunk works up here in the high desert of California, where we could take ET home. We've had anti-gravity, so-called electromagnetic anti-gravity, what have been termed ARVs, alien reproduction vehicles, which is a misnomer because humans started experimenting this before we had Roswell. It got augmented by Roswell. But so we've had that since the 50s. But everyone ignores, now I'm a medical doctor and I have family members who are PhD geneticists from UCSF and other top schools. Everyone's ignored the biological. So people think that, well, UFO people get their minds around the fact that there's been some really top secret stuff that's happened with free energy and anti-gravity, but a concomitant level, and maybe larger level, of top secret research has been done on biologicals. Now, because of that, we have to be very careful. In this sense, I guess I'm the biggest skeptic in this room about almost everything that's reported out as a UFO, because the first thing I have to go, after you've ignored people who see Venus or people who see whatever it is rising, or a star on the horizon twinkling, and it is something that is an unidentified object, is it ours or theirs? Is it ours or is it interstellar? You've got to go through that algorithm. First thing, off the bat, boom. Now, most people won't even get their mind around the fact that there are UFOs out there. Never mind that there is a secret Air Force and Space Force that has these technologies. Now, it doesn't mean that we've been allowed to use them as much as some of the information in the UFO media would report. It's not as if we're flying around the cosmos on these things, because Earth is under a relative, shall we say, quarantine until we stop acting like mad dogs. And you know, in the emergency department, there's something called an involuntary commitment, so that when someone is of danger to themselves or others, they're committed for a psychiatric hold so they don't go out and shoot up a school. Or do something else. So humans, unfortunately, have not evinced the requisite peacefulness and higher consciousness to be entrusted with interplanetary and interstellar travel. But this has pissed off the classified projects to no end. So it's developed into a little bit of a shooting war that a lot of people don't know about. So here's the next thing I'm going to drop on you. If you're not on the edge of your seat yet, you will be. Beginning in 1940s, we worked on things that might be called in the sort of pop culture Tesla technologies, things that were high voltage systems that created strange electromagnetic effects. And this goes back actually to the late 1800s, mid to late 1800s and early 1900s. But by the 1920s, they were doing work like T. Townsend Brown, who later kind of became the core of the RAND think tank, and was pulled into secret Air Force and Army and Air Force operations. But in the 20s, he was doing things with high voltage systems causing mass cancellation so that things would float and lift and move. And it wasn't ion propulsion. That was 1920s. A similar level of research and development was going on using communication systems, but also what are called scalar or longitudinal weapon systems. Everything from so-called radionics and psychotronics that affect thought and consciousness to devices that could be weaponized as a burst of energy to interfere with something at a great distance. In other words, something very sophisticated. So when in 1945, a little bit of history here, we're at a school so we can be professorial for a minute, there was a thing called the Manhattan Project out here in White Sands, where we detonated eventually the first atomic bomb, which subsequently the United States dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But there was, by 1947, there was only one atomic bomb squadron in the world. The Soviets didn't have it, the British didn't have it, the French didn't have it. They were working on it. And it was in a place called Roswell, New Mexico. And all of you know what happened at Roswell, except you don't. You don't go from interstellar distances and just lose your way in broad daylight over the desert of New Mexico and run out of gas and crash. All right, so let's pretend we have a brain. What actually happened, and this is in a document on our website from the FBI, from Guy Hotel, a field agent, to the J. Edgar Hoover, is that a special and new radar installation, euphemism, radar, electromagnetic, but it was configured to have this scalar longitudinal energy in it, which basically, what that is, light is a wave like this, okay, and if you have a laser, it's all one wavelength that is synchronized coherently, which is like green or blue or red. That's what a laser is. And this crystal is used to create that coherence. But then, what if you have light that is a point that doesn't have a wave aspect, but it's just a line? Well, now you're going in multiples of the speed of light. And it is. It is not limited to the speed of 186,000 miles per second. But that technology can and has been weaponized. Okay, so now we get to what was really at Roswell that they were experimenting with that caused two ET vehicles to run into each other. One crashed north of Roswell and just exploded in smithereens because it hit the other one when they switched the system on, because it was a fully materialized 3D object, which they are very careful not to do anymore. We'll get to this. The other one continued on a western trajectory and impacted near Socorro, and that's where the little EB, the little extraterrestrial biological entity, was retrieved that you've heard about. That did happen. So that whole cat and mouse game, or cowboys and Indians nonsense, began in the 40s. Now that's 70 years ago almost, 68 years ago, this summer. So the technologies that allow for tracking, targeting, and hitting interstellar vehicles has gone through multiple generations of refinement. And I won't bore you, we don't have enough time to go into all the information we've collected on this, but just from an operational fund of knowledge you all need to have. A man that I know who was an electronics genius had a corporation that developed a neutrino light detector. And what that was his way of expressing when an object is not fully in the 3D, it's not fully materialized, it moves as it begins to cross from the transdimensional world, which is closely approximated to what you would call astral dream body energy. You're going to find out in a minute why they call dreamland dreamland out here at Area 51. That spacecraft, as it steps down, as it were, from the energy and resonant field that's transdimensional and non-materialized, releases a burst of this neutrino energy or neutrino light that this man, not for that purpose, for other research purposes, had invented a detector for. But in 1974, I believe it was, he was hit with a national security order, bless you, a national security order, NSO, so that technology was seized and put on all the NRO satellites, National Reconnaissance Office. So now we have a geosynchronous position satellite system that looks not only towards Earth but out into space with these detectors that can pick up an ET craft when it's stepping down out of transdimensional space, we'll discuss this, or hyperdimensional, into 3D, and then lock on it, and they will then attempt to hit it with one of these scalar longitudinal weapons, and sometimes with EMP, other kinds of electronic weapons. And so began the era of what Lynn Stringfield called the crash retrieval process, where over a period of time from the 40s up to, not that, well, still going on, where objects were on occasion, now the hit rate isn't that high, but where on occasion they would be able to target and hit these objects with these electromagnetic systems, and they would be damaged or destroyed or would crash. I have one man on my team who worked near Fort Huachuca, which is Army Intelligence Headquarters, and there's an underground base there. And back in the 70s, at that time, they had 9 extraterrestrial vehicles that were in storage there, and also the bodies from different species had been autopsied near Fort Huachuca, which ironically is near Tombstone, Arizona. There's some weird ironies in all of this. Now, why did I divert into all that? Because when I stepped on the stage in 1990, starting the Close Encounters of the Fifth Kind initiative, using consciousness and remote viewing to contact ETs, we stepped into a hornet's nest that had been in the making already for 40 or 50 years. And what the result of that was, I was immediately contacted by people in the intelligence community, and the former head of Army Intelligence and some NSA people who said, "What the hell do you think you're doing?" And I said, well, I'm doing exactly what I've written I'm doing. I'm going to organize teams to be citizen diplomats to these civilizations using advanced concepts in physics and consciousness. And basically I was threatened and told I shouldn't and couldn't, and I said, watch me. This was my initiation into, so now we're 23 years into me. This was in April of 1992 when this happened to me. And I was taken to a room till 3 in the morning and given the rubber hose treatment. Basically, and I turned to this guy who was on this majority committee for intelligence, Majestic, and I said, look, I'm going to do this. I'm not rich, but I'm a doctor. I don't need your money. I died when I was 17, and I know there is no death, and death is a myth, so I'm not afraid of you. And I figured out the Rosetta Stone of contact, and there's nothing you can do about it if enough people start doing it. And he went like this and looked at me and said, well, you know exactly who this son of a bitch is? This old white-haired guy said, yeah, that's right, I am that son of a bitch. And then I said a few other choice words. Hey, I'm an emergency doctor, not, you know, a new age whatever. So, here comes the chest tube. Nice. But, you know, and I basically said, look, I've done some research on you, and I've got some documents on you that if you get in my way, you'll be in Fort Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary for the rest of your life. So leave me alone. You know, so this is that in 92. For 23 years, I've been dealing with that level of chicanery and nonsense. But the key thing to understand is the thing that launched the Disclosure Project was this. This is what launched all of it. They knew we had figured out the Rosetta Stone where people can be, every ordinary people like me and you, forget the government high and mighties and all that, can become ambassadors from Earth to these people. And if enough people did it, this would be their ultimate nightmare because it's decentralized. See? I liken this to cosmic civil disobedience. Just like Martin Luther King with the civil rights movement, if you've seen Selma, or Gandhi, or whoever, we're owning our right to be free citizens of the earth, free our minds from the disinformation, go into the future in universal consciousness and peace, and create a time of universal peace for 500,000 years. That's our job. Now, the specifics of this get really interesting because a lot of people don't know how the Disclosure Project started, and I'm going to give you a real quick trip through this. After we successfully tested with groups of people and made contact, and they knew we had, it made its way up through the chain of command, and by the time President Clinton got elected and took office in January of 1993, some folks approached me who said, look, we really love what you're doing, and it's time that this should happen. But we need to reach out to people and deconflict, was the military term, what you're doing with the military operations that are targeting and tracking these craft. I said, well, that'd be great if we can do it. So I had a military advisor who set up meetings between me and initially the head of the Foreign Aerospace Science and Technology Center, which was the Foreign Technology Division back in the 40s of the Air Force at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. This is where the Roswell stuff was sent. And what was interesting, the guy who set up the meeting was the head of intelligence for the Joint Chiefs of Staff, a Navy guy who later became the DNI, the Director of Naval Intelligence. And he asked Wright-Patterson to take this meeting with me. And they said, no, we won't. So he went to the head of the Air Force and ordered it. And the head of the Air Force Intelligence ordered the meeting. So then I went to it. And so I went to the meeting with this, the energy of this. I didn't care what they had there because I already knew what they had there. I went there to tell them what we were doing and to ask them to respect our space and leave us alone. And that was the beginning of a series of briefing with top military folks in 1993. The other thing that happened around that time is that a group of us decided to make a run at the incoming President Clinton, who was open to this and had told friends of his that contacted me that he was incredibly interested in UFOs but didn't know what to make of it, and that he and his CIA director, R. James Woolsey, had asked about it through channels and had been basically lied to. If you read Webster Hubbell's book, Friends in High Places, he talks about the fact that the president tried to find out about UFOs and, quote, were not happy with the answers they were getting. So they reached out to me and I said, well, okay, let's make a briefing. So what you have now, if you go to SeriousDisclosure.com, the briefing materials are various generations. This is what we gave to President Obama, of the briefing asked for by President Clinton and his CIA director. And what we wanted to have happen, now this is in my constitutional naivete. I was in my 30s, young doctor, thought we still actually had a democracy and a government that was functional. How foolish of me, I presuppose. But I was young and full of hope, thought that would happen. So I contacted, we did this and asked the president, and after I briefed the CIA director, and it was a huge white paper that's in my first book, Extraterrestrial Intelligence, the Evidence and Implications. Most people don't realize that book exists. It has all these white papers in it. So, position papers and recommendations for the president. And I realized very quickly, within about a month or two, that the president didn't want to do it. But the reason the meeting was set up to begin with is because the friend of the CIA director and the president had known that we made contact through the CE5 initiative. So this interplanetary ambassador program is what started the Disclosure Project. And it started it quite accidentally. I never thought that I would go there at all. I wasn't interested in these politicians and military people. But what I realized was that we weren't doing this in a vacuum. We're doing this in a world that's become an armed camp, and we needed to take that into account if we were going to do it wisely and carefully. So I started this whole process, and it was called Project Starlight. You know, the Associated Press sued the Clinton Library and got these documents a few years ago. And I was kind of mentoring a guy named Lawrence Rockefeller about this, who was friends with the Clintons, and it goes on and on. So, and you can read about that and hear about that another time. But the point I'm making is that the reason all that happened was that we wanted to have the president lead the effort with contact and disclosure. But a good friend of the president's came to my house and said, look, we think that this is great, but if the president pushes on this issue, he'll end up like Jack Kennedy. And so I said, well, what do you want me to do? And he said, well, you need to do it. I said, how nice of you. And it became very clear to me that what they were saying is that I wasn't important, I was expendable, and it didn't matter if I was killed. So I accepted that, as that my place in the world is an unimportant I'm the throwaway person, you know, it's expendable. So at least people in Washington think. So that's fine. And then what happened, we went to the Congress. So I met with members of the Senate Intelligence Committee and all this, and then they were very interested, but then they would get a visit and a little bit of a threat, and they'd put their tail between their legs and run. So then comes 2001, the National Press Club event, where we had the first of the military top secret people come forward, and I went around the world interviewing 110 of them, and now there's 500 or 600 of them. Most of them don't want to be on videotape. Some are, and are waiting. I can release their information when they pass away posthumously. But so the whole disclosure movement started because we realized that the world needed to be educated on this, and initially we wanted the heads of states to do it, and then they wouldn't do it, so maybe the people's representatives to do it, and then they wouldn't do it, we have to do it. So we did it. And now 50 to 60% of the population believe UFOs are real, and the government's citing something when it used to be 25%. However, most people don't know the level of the granular detail we're going into here today, which you need to know if you're going to be an ambassador to these civilizations. Now, the CE5 initiative was always what was in my heart and soul as the really exciting, beautiful thing to accomplish. To create teams of people all over the world who would go out using this concept in peace to make contact with these civilizations, direct contact. And that's what we did. And so initially it was just a few people, then it was a few hundred people. Now if you get the app, you'll see the whole globe is lit up with little CSETI triangles, and what we call the little logo symbol for the Center for the Study of Extraterrestrial Intelligence. Every continent, virtually every country, has teams. By the way, if you want to find who's in your area, you just go there and download the app. It's a free app. It's the etcontactnetwork.com app, but it's linked from our website, SiriusDisclosure.com. There's also a training app that takes you through the remote viewing course, all the protocols and everything that's also available. And there are thousands of people doing that. So now we have teams on every continent and virtually every country doing this. And it's creating what Rupert Sheldrake called the morphogenic field effect. So we're getting to breakout, where you have then thousands, and eventually we'll have millions of people understanding that they can bypass these lame and useless bureaucracies in our governments and just do it themselves. Empower yourselves. And someone once asked me, you know, because there's a NASA regulation about having contact with extraterrestrials, I said, well, first of all, the people who wrote that don't know what they're talking about. And secondly, if you need an authority figure to say it's okay to do this, I hereby give you permission. I mean, you know, people are so fun. Who's responsible for this? Nobody. Because there is this corrupt and illegal operation, which we proved was illegal. If you're in a project where you are lying to the President of the United States and the members of Congress, it is a priori illegal. Full stop. End of discussion. Once we proved that, and we wrote a letter to every division of the government stating this, we said, we're going to come forward with documents, evidence, top secret testimony from people who had security oaths, but that they were all exonerated from it because the operations are themselves illegal and cannot cite the National Security Act to enforce it. Do you know, to this day, not a single person has been prosecuted in our team. This is not like Edward Snowden. Because Snowden revealed things that were being overseen by the President and the Select Committee on Intelligence. We're revealing things that are where they're deceiving the President and the oversight committees, and therefore they are rogue and illegal, and we can do anything we want with it. Get it? That's one of the reasons why we went through this process from 1993 to 2001 to dot the I's and cross the T's. Because if we had not done it properly, it could have been claimed that there was appropriate control and oversight, and therefore the people I was asking to step forward outside their national security oaths were breaking the law. We had to go through this process. That was the thinking behind it. I wanted you to know that. But all the time we're doing that, we're going out with these teams doing contact. Because I knew that the real action is with the masses taking this back. So the only way that can happen is if people understand who they're contacting, how they appear here, and what are the protocols. What's the science behind this? And the science behind this is centrally located in the science of consciousness and transdimensional physics. So now I want to transition into that. Having laid this created the milieu of how all this developed. Because if you go out under the stars and you don't know the difference between a Lockheed Martin or Northrop alien reproduction vehicle and an ET vehicle, you don't know what you're doing. I'll give you a hint. The ones that are made by us feel like it, look like it, and they have moving parts and rivets and seams if you're up close. Interstellar vehicles do not. Now, we need to go into something what I call interstellar transdimensional technologies. And the first one, and the most important one, is how do you communicate? You know, at certain points in the orbits, the Earth is an hour by cell phone or electro radio signal from Mars, our closest planet. So if you had to say, hello, how are you? You'd have to have an hour for someone to get the signal, and then they say, I'm doing fine today, how are you? And it took us 2 hours to Mars. And I remember when I was meeting with the CIA director, his wife came, who was the chief operating officer of the National Academy of Sciences, and she was prescient enough to ask the question, what, how are they possibly communicating with their home planet once they get here from another star system? I said, yes, the speed of light is just too damn slow. It's only 186,000 miles per second. So to get just across our galaxy, and we're one of billions of galaxies, the Milky Way, it'd take 100,000 years, Earth years, to get a signal from point A to B, and another 100,000 to get the message back. And I thought to myself, well, do I tell this lady the truth and seem like a kook? Or do I tell her something that sounds scientific and be respectable? And I decided to tell her the truth. So I said, here's the thing. You can take one of these, and an advanced version of it, an electromagnetic box, a little thing, but it's so refined in its electromagnetic systems that they cross over beyond the speed of light into, and even beyond the so-called scalar longitudinal systems I talked about, into what I call coherent thought or feeling and consciousness. So they become what I wrote a paper in 1991 called The Comprehensive Assessment of the UFO ETI, Extraterrestrial Intelligence Subject. And in it I talk about technology-assisted consciousness, which is when you have a technological device that augments your awareness and assists with remote viewing and communication. Okay, so that's technology-assisted consciousness. But there's also consciousness-assisted technologies, where the consciousness of the person assist the technology or the guidance system or the what have you on the spacecraft. It goes both ways, is what I'm saying. So there's TAC and CAT. So technology-assisted consciousness and consciousness-assisted technologies. And what this means is that you can put your awareness in a coherent way from a centered intent, and this would then begin to communicate. So you don't have to touch it, and you don't have to have an electromagnetic signal to it. Exactly what Dr. John at Princeton Engineering and Anomalies Research Lab, who was Professor Emeritus of Engineering, not New Age crystals, discovered. That the conscious mind and thought in a coherent way can interface with an electromagnetic device. But in that case, it was just causing sort of a crude response. Here we're talking about precision. Precision devices that interface with thought and consciousness. Now, why is that? First of all, it has to be. If they're from another star system, they have to have that. And secondly, it is the nature of going superluminal, faster than the speed of light. So the instant, let's say you take an object and you put a resonant field around this at certain voltages, and it begins to shift the angular momentum and spin of all the atoms. I'm not going to get into too much physics here because you'll all fall asleep. But this can just begin to shift. Now, it may first become massless or approach masslessness and begin to float. But you can shift it a little further and it disappears. Quote, unquote, dematerializes. That's the pop term for it. But that it's actually just shifted into another dimension. Okay, this is why the trans-dimensional physics are what is really, that whole area of science is what's really key. So once you reach the crossing point of light, the ability to move something out of linear 3D or 4D, if you won't count time, space and time, you move it into an energy field that very closely approximates visualized thought. How many people here have had a lucid dream where you're flying in the dream? I'm just curious to see. Almost everyone. Here's some news. That's what that is. So, very close to it. Okay, we're going to get into some refined ideas here. So when you are actually in the dream state, and what the Aboriginals in Australia call dream time, you're actually, you're so-called, the mystics called it astral body, but it actually has a physical component. I don't like the term metaphysics. So you just say metaphysics, well, you don't know what it is. It's nothing metaphysical about it. It's very physical. So your astral body actually is a sort of thought light form blueprint that actually manifests the physical body, not the other way around. And within that body of light is the thought body, the essence of the thought, essence of what you are. And within that is this field of quiet consciousness. So as it turns out, and many other layers, I'm doing the big ones, it turns out the entirety of the cosmos, not just the universe, but all these other dimensions are folded perfectly like a quantum conscious hologram inside you and you and you, and every single one of us. Everyone. So you don't have to go anywhere to see distant places. You go within. Inner space and outer space become one. Does this make sense? Now when you're traveling in a spacecraft, a little bit of nuance here, you're using technologies that have shifted the entire spacecraft and the people in it into another dimension that is a higher frequency than the speed of light and the speed of electrons. But it's still very much a science. And then you can go from point A to point B, not in 100,000 light years, but maybe in a couple days. It's not instant, the thought is instant, but there is a coefficient of drag because of the thickness of the astral component as it moves on the underbelly of 3D space-time. Get it? Well, I'll go through this a little more in detail in a moment. So I know we're getting into some really deep science here and also consciousness. You've got to understand this to go out and know what you're doing. Now, what I call the gap or the interface between 3D, 4D, and 5, 6, 8, 10, 12. People say, how many dimensions are there? I said, how many numbers are there between 0 and infinity? There's an infinite number of gradations and degrees. But there are certain clear points of breakout. Well, a big one is beyond the speed of light. So the crossing point of light requires you to understand the electronics, which in the propulsion system of these craft, they do use crystalline materials and nanocrystalline materials, very high voltages at certain resonant frequencies. They can get lift and they can create a bubble, if they're fully materialized still, a sort of a space-time bubble around them where they can move at 100,000 or 200,000 miles per hour and make a right-hand turn and not kill everyone on board because it's controlled for 1 G. But they can also just be hovering above your house, but shifted beyond the resonant field frequency of electrons and light into this other dimension. So it could be, there could be an interstellar vehicle in this room. You wouldn't see it. You might detect it, and you might be able to remote view it, and we may be able to have some instruments that would pick it up. We'll get into this in a moment. Is this getting too weird too soon? Okay, in the first hour I wanted to go, okay, so here we go. Now we're going to get into the really weird stuff. So, all right. So what I'd like people to understand for a minute, okay, just visualize, if you will, this, oh, there. Not exactly surgical quality chair, but sorry, just sewed up your eyelid to your forehead. We have now in our awareness this ability to understand that the mind, the conscious field, which is infinite, omnipresent, and your thought body, that's visual, the so-called astral, and then thought that is beyond the visual, the essence of thought. They're called causality. Paramahansa Yogananda called it the causative universe, the causality, the essence, the seed, essence, knowledge of things. All of this is folded within us. And this is why it's been said by the Sufi masters, thinkest thyself a puny form when within thee the universe is folded. So the entirety of the cosmos, and not just the 3D universe or 4D, but all these other dimensions are folded within the architecture of consciousness, the structure of mind, if you go into quiet, deep states. And this is why so many people who go into the meditative deep state begin to experience and see other dimensions, including those who have passed on out of their physical bodies into those worlds, but other strange things, like interstellar vehicles that may be hovering above your house that aren't visible with the naked eye, but pop into your vision, and then start turning on your cell phone and communicating with you. Strange stuff. So, if you're wanting to make contact with these interstellar civilizations, you at least need to move beyond the smoke signals phase of understanding, right? So we're not communicating with each other anymore with smoke signals. We use radio waves. And let's be a little humble here. All of our smartphones, not so smart. They're using technology from the 1800s. I mean, the first telegraph was in 1844, right? You know this? That's what it's also. That's all it's using. Now it's been miniaturized and it's, you know, but that's all it is. It's still at the speed of light. Everything that has been developed that is transdimensional in physics, new energy, where you get energy from these other dimensions, including the 0 point in quantum vacuum and what have you, anti-gravity, and communication systems that have been developed since the mid-1900s are classified. So let's think about let's take a big step back. Our cars, the engine, Mercedes, 1888, something like that. Trains, choo-choo trains, mid-1800s. Jets were invented in the 30s, didn't get into widespread application until later, but 1930s. And rockets, 1940s. Atomic power, nuclear power, 1940s. That's it. So do you really believe that there has been no development in physics or science that are in applied physics for 70 years? Which is ridiculous. But no one's asking the question. We ride around on the freeway in these clunky things from the 1800s and fly on jets from the 1930s and send people on Roman candle rockets that blow up periodically like the space shuttle from the 1940s or from the Chinese rocket era. There is no reason for us to be living so stupidly on the planet, but we are. But part of it is that we have to become informed of what is out there. And it isn't just free energy devices and anti-gravity, it's the transdimensional physics and the understanding of where consciousness and thought interface with space and time and matter. So you hear this accounts of the adept yogis who have reached a state where they can levitate. That's real. Or where they can, solid matter can go through solid matter, or where you can materialize an object. All the things that can be done with interstellar technologies from other star systems can also be done with consciousness and thought if you develop it fully. And these are called the miracles. Well, it's only a miracle if you don't understand what it is, right? One person's miracle is another person's light switch. Think about it. Take this to Thomas Jefferson. A couple hundred years ago, near where I live in Virginia. We were Monticello, his house. And it would be metaphysical. It would be fantastic. It would be a miraculous thing. Now we use it with alacrity and actually with no big fanfare. And that's only 200 years of development from Thomas Jefferson's time to that. And that's including the fact that for 70 years, most scientific breakthroughs in development have been seized and are classified. So now extrapolate with a little bit of humility, which humans tend to have a hard time grasping, that we're really kind of half a step out of the jungle, our civilization, just kind of out a little bit. And Saturday night in the ER, not even that. And we call it the gun and knife club, all the shootings and stabbings and clubbings. But what you find is that if you begin to contemplate the technological exponential progression that we've had in, say, 100 years, that even we know about, and extrapolate that out 10 to the 6th to 10 to the 7th years, 100,000 to a few million years. And that's what we're dealing with. We're dealing with civilizations that have technologies that are in the hundreds of thousands to millions of years past what is extant on Earth today, that exists today. So that begins to make us think, whoa, what and how might these civilizations want to communicate with us? And how would they manifest? Well, it's going to be in ways that are, to the average person, bizarre, just as this would have been bizarre to Thomas Jefferson or to your grandparents. So with that in mind, now let's go into sort of an exploration of the sciences, not singular, but plural, the sciences of transdimensional physics and consciousness. Because now we're talking about civilizations that, as easily as you and I go down the freeway, go down the transdimensional freeways of the multiverse of the cosmos, and can go from one star system to another and communicate from one star system to another. So their technologies are such that they can be in 3D, or they can be in these other dimensions superimposed within, as it were, or around 3D. And you wouldn't see it with the naked eye. You may only get a hint of it. So sometimes, many of you have had this experience, you'll be having a contact experience, and there'll be just a point of light that goes bing. What's that? Or something that looks like a sphere, a globe, orb, people call it. Or something that's just sort of a scintillating light. Or something that looks like a heat wave, a field distortion between what should be in the air. That your physical eyes are picking this up. Well, it could be a lot of things, but often when we're out making contact using the protocols that involve the laser light we send up, the beeping tones we send out, and the meditation we do that centers us in deep consciousness, it then carries us into the remote viewing mode. Those ET civilizations will appear around us with all kinds of manifestations and phenomena that are strange. So, for example, you're going to see this in a moment. We were at Joshua Tree National Park, and we were in Circle out in a place called Geology Tour Road. You can go there. 800,000 acre park, 2 hours from here. Go. And we've gone there every year pretty much since 1996. And we're sitting there, and we're in our circle, and we take a break, and I go out east of the circle into the desert. And suddenly I'm with a few people, and this thing the size of a softball or a grapefruit appears right here beside me, fully materialized. And I go, oh, hello. So we go, oh, how nice, they're here. So I'm told we need to get the group back together. So I walk back up to the circle, and we start asking everyone to come into circle. We start hearing on the southeast part of the circle, just outside the circle, a group of people talking in a language not English and not Swahili, an interstellar or some other language. But I have these really advanced military-grade night scopes. And I'm looking, and it's in empty air. But everyone is hearing this, and we hear these voices of an interstellar species talking in the desert. Okay, this is not even the bizarre part yet. So I tell everyone, let's get back into clear consciousness. And a woman who was with me, Raven, I said, take a picture, because they're right there. And I actually pointed out where they were, and we could hear it. She could hear it. Everyone did. This was not some sort of mental thing. And she takes a picture, and in the picture is an interstellar ambassador who had responded to our invitation from the Andromeda galaxy, 2.5 million light years from here, who is hovering outside the circle, waving and turning with this impish smile on his face. You're going to see it in a minute. Now, with the naked eye, all we saw was this thing that would look like an orb. But in the cone of light that you'll see in this picture, which the digital camera could pick up, but our eyes can't, because the digital CCD, or whatever they call light cells, are more sensitive than our eyes, is this interstellar ambassador waving to us. And then we made our circle, and we began to go into deep meditation. And we have these detectors. We have a tri-field meter that is a magnet, and we put it on the magnetic scale, where it picks up on the flux and the movement of the magnetic field around us, which should not move if you're out in the wilderness. And then we have a radar detector, and we have something that picks up lightning bolts if you're a backpacker. But these are all things that pick up electromagnetic energy in different ways. And we have those, and all of a sudden, the detectors start singing and talking. And so for about an hour, this group of ETs go inside the circuitry of these detectors and start communicating. Now, they're not speaking English, they're speaking some sort of mathematical code, which we recorded. Strange? Well, no, this isn't even strange yet. So that is what you need to be understanding. And they don't necessarily have to be 3D to communicate. Now, when we have had them fully materialize, for example, we had a craft that fully materialized near us at Mount Shasta. You're going to see it's a light ship that lifts up from the ground and goes out into space. Within minutes of there, we had helicopters and jets swarming over the site because it came from the transdimensional field into the field that began to release the neutrino light I talked about into something visible with the naked eye, and then the military came in. Now that only happens usually when I'm around. People who are doing this individually have amazing contact experiences, and that doesn't happen. It's because if we're doing something like that, it's an announced event, and obviously they're going to track what we're doing. But the point is that these civilizations can move into our dimension of 3D and 4D as easily as you and I walk through a door. But they're coming from other dimensions and may appear in ways that you don't expect. And every time, like this event we just did in near Joshua Tree, we were on a house with 640 acres that we rented. I found out that Leonardo DiCaprio and all of these people had used it because it had a helicopter landing spot, which we used as our site for the week. And we're there at a break. Interesting. We do these meditations. We kind of relax, start having what I call conviviality and bebidas. You know, just sort of have something to drink and something to eat. And we're out under the stars. And this ship, very quickly, unfortunately, the camera guy was going to the bathroom, but it materializes here and goes across the head of the valley at eye level, but in about 1 or 2 seconds. But everyone looking where sees this beautiful golden red ship that was a little bit shaped like almost a little bit chevron shaped, but at ground level. Followed by all the electronics starting to interface and go off. Very unusual events. At that point I said, look, we need to go into consciousness and see if we can apprehend the message. So that begins to be a very intuitive process that you become perfected at the more you do this. And one of our detectors is a very simple radar detector where it'll go beep beep for yes and beep 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 we're here, and you begin to pick up on a pattern, and then something will manifest around you. So you have what's going on at the site after we've sent up our lasers and sent out these electronic tones that were actually recorded by the BBC in a crop circle in England. This is all on the app. It's just this little app you download. You can do it anywhere. You do this meditation, which we're going to do in the second half of this. So just a brief example of what we do, where we go into the meditative state using the mantra, Vedic mantra, and then go into the remote viewing capability and then do what's called coherent thought sequencing, where you see where they are and then show them where you are, where you literally zoom in like Google Earth, where you're going from space, zooming right into where you are. But at that point, anything is possible. And so the kind of phenomenon we've had have included, for example, we're at Shasta one time, up here in Northern California, we're in circle, and all of a sudden the most beautiful crystalline sound comes through the group. Now the recorder we had was just not a very high quality one, so it just picked up this sound, but it sounded like a crystal sound, but it was coming not from one place, it seemed like coming from everywhere. And then it moved. And everyone had their eyes closed in meditation, and every single person saw this spherical spacecraft in their mind and the astral move through them and move through the circle while this tone was happening. Very strange stuff, but beautiful, magical. And you know, everyone's wanting to see something like in Close Encounters of the Third Kind, and that does happen too, where you have a craft fully materialized. But I always tell people, if that happens, it's going to be picked up, and you're going to probably get some jets and aircraft in there pretty fast. So what the ETs have learned to do with this initiative is interface with us on every level: thought, consciousness, sound, light, electronics, tones, and visible, materialized 3D. So I go into this only to prepare people for the fact that there's a multiplicity of ways in which these civilizations, once you set up the correct resonant coherence with your group, will appear. And it may be something that you're just absolutely wouldn't even imagine. Another example, we were up at Blanca Peak in Colorado one year, a few years ago, and there was a man in our group who we were in our meditative state, said, would you do something that just would make me meaningful for me? And he was a sort of a computer nerd and mathematician, and he wanted them to begin to communicate through the Big Dipper, you know, the stars in the Big Dipper, by turning them on and off. Well, you can't turn off stars, but sure enough, there was a reddish glowing object that came into the sky, was sort of sitting by a cloud, vanished, and then one by one, for 23 minutes precisely, different stars in the Big Dipper in a crystal clear Colorado sky went on and off. And sometimes two would be off at a time, or three. Now I have these really good night scope binoculars, I'm looking, I'm going, oh, there's nothing up there. But they were creating an energy field, and they were using that as a communication. Does that make sense? Strange. So if it's strange, it's extraterrestrial. If it's clunky and just floating across the desert, it's made by Lockheed Martin. All right? Now, that's a bit overly simplistic, but there's a lot of truth to it. There's a very famous producer here in Hollywood who, I'm not going to name who it is, but you would know his name if I said his name. And he went out in the desert with us once, and one of the things that he remarked on was the reason he took an interest is that many years ago he was with someone, and there was this object that appeared that was not quite fully materialized, that was this gorgeous, it was like it was this living, organic thing, and with a light that was just amazing. And he and this person he was with had this amazing contact experience in thought that came to him. But it was visible but not solid. And then a few years later, he was in the Unita Mountains outside the Dugway Proving Grounds, the top secret underground facilities that are there near Provo, Utah. And this thing came along, and they were going to do it, scouting for places for a film they were doing. And suddenly, they saw it, and saw it close enough, and it had rivets, and it had seams. And he says, you know, that just felt like a man-made machine to me. And as he described it to me, I said, oh, it was. It was one of the out of Dugway, which is very much the state of the art, not Area 51. So he just intuitively knew it, but what he described and what I'm describing is what you should be looking for. And when we do these protocols, we find that the ETs will always let us know when they're there. And it may be something that, I mean, on this trip, there were things that happened I had never seen before, and I've been going out for 25 years with thousands of people on teams doing this. And I think we have to begin to think, well, if these civilizations want to interact with us, they don't have to meet our expectations. Maybe they're expecting us to meet theirs. Maybe they're expecting us to go into states of consciousness where we go beyond 3D and 4D and our linear thinking mind and egos into a state where we can actually see them hovering all around us. They've come all these hundreds of thousands of light years. Why can't we go a fraction of that distance? Now, this requires a certain awakening in your understanding of what it means to be a human. But it isn't difficult. And please don't make it difficult. If you wish to be in a state of consciousness where you can accurately remote view, all of that is in this app. You can sit quietly, go into the meditative state, and begin to experience what Dr. Walter Russell called the universal one, this state of consciousness that is the singularity. And it's very, very easy to do. You can do it through breathing techniques. You can do it through meditative mantra techniques. I know a doctor who used to play the harp, and that would put her in a state of mind where she would go into that, and then she'd start remote viewing other places. And she was on our team here in Los Angeles for many years. So I think, and I don't have an attachment to what technique you use, so long as it gets you there. You see what I'm saying? I'm not a chauvinist about meditative approaches. I think that we have to understand that if there are 7 billion people on this planet, it's like 7 billion spokes on a wheel. The center of that wheel is the hub of the wheel of life, which is that silent, centered, unbounded state within ourselves, that calm, quiet mind. And there are many ways to get there. Prayer, meditation, various techniques, pranayama, breathing techniques. What I'm going to do later is just sort of a meditative, I'm going to teach you the mantra. So you're going to get a whole meditation course today. It's going to be preceded by a breathing technique, a pranayama technique. But the main thing to understand is that once you understand once you get that the conscious mind is not limited to here and now. It's here and now, but it's omnipresent. So when you have your lucid dreams, how many people have had a dream of something that then happens a day or a week or a year later? I'm curious. What's called a precognitive lucid dream. How did that happen? Well, it's because you're in a relaxed state. Your kind of intellect and ego is kind of less dominant. And this integrative state, a very gentle, integrated state of consciousness, is what is prominent. And so you can then, in this state of consciousness, see a distant place, also a distant time. Because consciousness is not only not bound by space, it's not bound by time. And that's how you can then see the past or apprehend things into the future. Now, when you talk of the future, you can only speak of probable futures, because anything you say and do can alter that. There are a billion different fractals that come into play. But you may get some very accurate hits. I call it a hit into the future. And so once we understand that the conscious mind has all these abilities that we haven't bothered to develop, it isn't that, you don't have it, it's just most people don't bother. I like bodybuilding, and I bench press 410 pounds. I assure you, you're not going to go in and bench press 410 pounds first time you go into the gym. You'd kill yourself. So I know, I'm sort of the old silverback gorilla of the Gold's Gym. But anyway, I like being a silverback gorilla. Anyway, I'll be 60 in June, but why not? 4 kids and the 8th grandchild's on the way in September. But why not? I know. It's scary having me as a father and grandfather. But so what's fun about this is to play with it, enjoy it. Don't make it hard. Don't overly intellectualize it. So the meditative state is a relaxed state, and you just go into it and then let it flow. Now, extraterrestrial civilizations, when they are traveling, or even when they're hovering in our atmosphere or above this auditorium, I'll be interested to see if there are any sightings in LA over the next week that are related to this, or often are. They can be seen or unseen, but depending on whether they're shifted beyond the speed of light or not. But remember, their experience and their paradigm is easily shift between 3 and 4D into these other dimensions as you and I get on a jetliner, which would have been magic to someone 200 years ago. So understanding their reality in a compassionate way is important, but it's also important to realize it's easy to understand it if you know yourself. It was like the Greek in the tradition, know thyself and to thine own self be true. If we really know ourselves in deep consciousness, we're going to understand every one of these civilizations. And from an ethical point of view and philosophical point of view, if we experience this state of consciousness, that is this quiet, deep level that's universal, there are no aliens, because everyone is united, connected, even though there's this multiplicity of diversity, through the light of consciousness, the conscious intelligent center. That, being a singularity, is your anchor for what you have in common. So let's look around this room. You've got every race, every age, you've got people from all over the world. And amongst humanity, we fight over ephemera, you know, it's ridiculous things, whether it's this ism or this economic system or this sect or this thing or this little piece of land or what have you. But if we were awake, we would realize, what are we fighting over? Because in a deep level, this is what I call universal deep spirituality, which is required to create the world of our dreams, the dream of a universally peaceful society here and elsewhere. We have to personally experience that state. It isn't an intellectualization. It's the experience of the fact that we're awake, and we can be quietly awake and be aware that we are all beings. And this is what the Buddha called the heart of compassion. And in the early Christian area, it was the beatific state. There are every tradition describes this state. There's no monopoly on it, although people like to create monopolies and divisions. But the truth is that the spirit and the essence within us of the awake conscious being is fully in everyone. It's just a matter of whether you want to practice becoming quiet and realize it, and then put it into applied sciences, such as remote viewing, coherent thought sequencing, and contacting ETs for diplomatic peaceful contact. That's what in the Vedas would be called a siddhi, S-I-D-D-H-I, a power, an ability, a gift. But you can practice that. Same thing as you can practice, if you wish to, how to levitate. You know, although I'd say it's a lot of effort and not worth the trouble. Easier to walk across a footbridge. You know, the Buddha tells us that there's this great story of the Buddha coming across someone who'd spent so many years, about 30 years, practicing meditation, but for the purpose of being able to levitate across a stream. And he was full of pride and ego about this. And he was saying, "Oh, look, Buddha, I've mastered the ability to levitate." And he goes from one side of the stream to the other. And he did, and he actually did it, which can be done and has been done. And then the Buddha walks across the footbridge and says, "Yes, but you wasted 30 years of your life. You could have just used the footbridge." So we want to put our awareness on things that are actually useful in our lives and also useful for the planet. Because if you think about it, each of us are kind of universal generators. But when a bunch of us begin to do something, what Rupert Sheldrake, the Oxford biologist, called the morphogenic field effect, it has a multiplier effect that can alter those that we don't even know or meet because of the power of non-locality of consciousness, the spirit of mind that's omnipresent, which is why intercessionary prayer works, by the way. Now, an interesting little side note to the work of Dr. John at Princeton, he said he found that if there were two people who loved each other or were united, coherent, let's call it, and cared for each other, were to put their mind and agree to what the random number generator would do, it didn't have an arithmetic effect. In other words, it wasn't double the effect, it was an exponential effect. So what happens when thousands of people enter into the meditative state? What kind of coherence and effect does it have in the world, even on people we don't know? It's huge. But now we're talking about doing this for the purpose of creating a peaceful world civilization that becomes interstellar. And so the ETs, these civilizations, are enormously interested in people learning to do this and doing it together. And you don't have to do it with, 250 people. You can do it with 2, 3, 4 people. And people will tell you who've been on these expeditions for a week, it happens quite easily once you understand the principles. Does this make sense? Yeah? Let's go through some of these images. I want to play these. If you can play these folks up on the... Now what they're going to do, they're going to dim the light on me, and they're going to dim all the lights in the house. And after this, we're going to take a break, and then we're going to do the meditation. Thank you. This is this being I spoke to. This is Bijou, was his name. He's got a yarmulke. You can pause it here for a minute. Looks like a yarmulke. It's actually a teleportation device. It was photographed over the desert. He's not fully materialized. He looks like night vision glasses here and a concave, like Worf on Star Trek, forehead. It's kind of indented. But look at the size of the cranium from here to here. It's about 4 times or 3 times ours from here to the top of our heads. And when I was communicating with him through these detectors, I said, is your IQ around 450? And it went beep, beep, very bright. This is his nose is hitting the light. It was the cone of light. The orb was in this direction. You'll see that in a minute. And this is his mouth, his chest. This is his left hand. His right one is on his and this is one leg and another. And the chairs that we were sitting in were right here, and he was just behind them. We think he was around 4.5 feet tall. This is the most important photograph ever taken in the history of the UFO subject. Why? Because it's not of the machine they're traveling in. It's of an ambassador that's non-human who came to us and greeted us at Joshua Tree. Beautiful. Next. And when we were in Florida a few years ago, these are just samples of the things that happen on every trip. There was this being, and this is sand. It looks like a halo. This is a sort of trans-dimensional energy field. 2 eyes here, a head, sort of a torso, very kind of abstract. But it was a light being that appeared, and we were on the beach, and I saw this shimmering, and I asked the camera person, 'cause I'm 10 thumbs with a camera. You don't want to give me a camera. I'm pathetic. Give me a chest tube or a defibrillator, but not a camera. That's terrible, but true. So this is what appeared right there in front of us on the sand. This is the sand. These are not photoshopped. This is what they actually look like. Beautiful. Next. And I want to mention this, because in the early days, we went to England every year with Colin Andrews, God bless him, and we went into these contact mode, and our logo of the CSETI are 3 circles connected by a line. And this shape was being visualized by us and sent up to the ETs, and we asked them to make this form. Well, of course, if you put it in 3 dimensions, it's a tetrahedron. If you put it into 2 of them together, half merged, you get a Merkaba, which is part of the very advanced technique I teach and have been teaching for a long time. So that's how that happened, though. Now, a member of our team, you can do this at home, we were doing in Texas, and he felt I should stop, and this appeared. Ron Russell's a very famous space artist, and this object appeared very odd, and it appeared materialized and then dematerialized broad daylight. Interestingly, when I was doing a briefing for the French, and the French President Sarkozy's guys who did his briefings on UFOs came to Washington, they faxed me a drawing of exactly this object drawn by someone who had an encounter in 1960s in France. Now this, of course, you probably have all seen, but it's worth noting to have me narrate it. I mentioned this, we were on the beach, and all these objects start appearing, and we suddenly have one and then another and then another. And this is, of course, the one where you hear the guy, holy damn hot shit. Now, what's interesting is that back in those days, I didn't have this laser. I had a big kind of like spotlight thing we used, and I was making a triangle in the sky, and they moved and made a perfect triangle in response. Meanwhile, around us, we had the electronic devices going off, and these short, luminous, not materialized beings moving in the parking lot, which unnerved some ladies who were there, who hopped in their pickup truck and drove back to Pensacola. And by the way, this event was on the front page of the newspaper in Pensacola the next day, because it was seen by a wide area. Each of these craft were 30, 40 feet across, and were kind of blue, but this was an old Hi-8 camera. We have better cameras now, but this is what we had at the time. And it went on for about 20 or 25 minutes. Very close. These are not far away at all. So, and it just had gotten dark. It was in March. And what I say to people is that this was a group of folks who had never done this before, who went out. It was just sort of a 1-2 day event, and this happened. Of course, from this event, because it found its way into the media, it kind of, the intelligence community subsequently found me. So up until this point, I was not off the radar scope, but not so on it. This is a member of our team in Santa Fe. She felt the presence, didn't see it, aimed the camera, and this metallic seamless object moving probably about they're estimated about 500 miles an hour. We had it analyzed for some people at NASA. And it's just partially in this dimension. You can see it's almost ghost-like, but it's a seamless disk with a bit of a dome on it, moving across the sky. This was daytime, very close, but not a very large craft. I think it was a short-range reconnaissance craft. Now I love this one. These are just kind of put through here. We're in a cave meditating before the Disclosure Project event. We're leaving, and I can feel this one ET that came to me the day that my close friend Sherry, who was murdered, helping me do this. You know, a bunch of us were supposed to die in the 90s. I was supposed to die. And this happened. What is this? Not an artifact. And then the spirit of Sherry was this wash of pink light, but this blue cobalt object appeared right above the cave where we were doing a meditation. And someone took the picture, and it was there. And this is partially in this dimension, but enough that it was quite beautiful. This particular being, I call kindness, because she's so kind and so sweet. Oh, this, you need to hear the tones of this. I don't know if you can turn the sound on. This is the one I was talking about at Mount... Yep. And this sound came all the way through the group. It sounded a lot more crystalline than what you're hearing on this tape. This is also in the app, by the way. These tones are all on the app that you can get for your smartphones. And it was like a string of pearls, the way it moved through the group in terms of your visual. But with the naked eye, nothing was seen, but everyone heard this. And we were up in the National Forest there at Mount Shasta. Now this is just a sample of sort of a phenomenon that happens. This is me with my lightsaber. But and objects just appear that will then signal to us. And they're quite large, actually. And they will do it over and over again over the course of a night. So we call these cosmic light bulbs, where they're flash bulbs, where they just sort of appear and light up, sometimes bright enough to light up the whole ground around where we're in our circle, and then they dematerialize again. But they're still there. I always tell people that happens, but they're still present in a trans-dimensional way just beyond the crossing point of the speed of light. Stranger still are the ones that appear in the trees or near us in the circle, like these. Boom. Now these are not artifacts. And so this is a night vision monocular, so you can't see the color. Frequently these will be beautiful ruby red or cobalt blue objects. And in fact, Emily and I were there when this one happened, right in the tree. Lights up the side of the tree, and another one. It looks like a localized piece of lightning in front of the tree, but it isn't. So this is what you need to be aware of. Now, what's behind that light? We'll talk about that. Because if you were to go into the dimension that this is emerging from, it might be a massive ET craft that's 1,000 feet across. But all you're picking up in this dimension is its emergence into this dimension. This, you can see it actually rotate up. And then we have these objects. This looks like it's a satellite. It isn't. We go out with satellite charts, and this was at a time of night there were no satellites visible, and it gets very big and then moves over. Sometimes they'll stop and change directions. So these may be very high up in the sky, and then there'll be phenomena that's happening all around us like those other objects. And the main thing to understand is that if they're doing something like this, what they're really wanting you to do, it's like an invitation, come. Well, how are you going to come? We don't have a anti-gravity vehicle to go there. You go into consciousness and float up to them. You go to them. Does that make sense? Yeah. So here's another one. Often this spacecraft that I call the one that kindness is on, I call her that. She's an ET with a perfectly round head, like a round, and no hair and no outer ears, that I met in Sherry's apartment the night that Sherry passed away. And Sherry introduced me to her in the worlds of light and dreamtime. And every single time we've gone out since then, this ship has appeared. And it's classically blue to blue-white, diamond white object. Another one. So when you go out, you want to go out with a satellite chart. There are apps for this, or you can print them off from heavensabove.com. And be sure that you rule out satellites, and particularly iridium satellites that can flare up. I've seen a lot of people, and they're mistaking it.
Now they're confirming.
These are the detectors when we were at Joshua Tree one year. That is a radar detector. And this is the Orion. This is Sirius and Orion. And objects just were coming on and off everywhere. And we're in the middle of a desert with nothing that would make these detectors go off, except it's an anomalous electromagnetic signal. And this went for about 25 minutes. The first time. The second time it lasted for 2 hours. And the last chapter of my last book is my attempt to translate all these signals into what they were conveying. It's called Extraterrestrial Contact, Countdown to Transformation. That's the name.
As soon as we arrived in a circle here, this would happen.
Yeah, you did.
So just in a few minutes, we have all these objects lighting up like orbs around us in the sky while these detectors are going.
Another frequency?
Yeah.
EM?
It,
Thanks, yes.
see, the one under my chair
There's a beam right here.
speaks loudly and
There's a
softly.
beam right here.
Okay, so we can go to the next. This is at the Outer Banks. We went there, and this is some of the most fascinating footage. What is this? Broad daylight. We're on an ocean front. We have our whole team. And this object we had seen go into the ocean the night before, and it looks partially in this dimension. It's very fuzzy. Many of you may have seen objects like this, but when you do the contrast for it, you'll see its shape. Here it is. And it was hovering over the ocean very close to the house. The night before, we saw an object that lit up, that materialized and dematerialized and then materialized, going at an angle into the ocean.
Oh my God!
That was great.
Okay, watch again. We're at our site at Mount Shasta. An object in front of us lifts up right here. Yeah, it's a light ship, transdimensional. The camera guy was amazing that he could track it. He was following my laser. You'll see my laser come in. Here it is. And it dematerializes, but it's almost like inchworming halfway in this dimension. But prior to that, we'd been having a contact experience in our meditation from the beings on this ship. So this is lifting up right in front of the mountain at Mount Shasta. I do recommend you go there if you have the opportunity to practice these protocols. Now these are more of these images. This is just to give you an idea. There's the orb that appeared. This is not a planet. It's right here by the bush. And it creates a cone of light that illuminates all the blankets on the chairs. It was very cold. And there's this weird lit area here. That's this being that once you increase the brightness, you'll see what he looks like. Looks like an angel with the wings, but that's the trans-dimensional energy field. Makes you wonder if some people have seen ETs and thought they were angels. But this is the head, the chest, one leg, the other one kicked behind in his hand. Very etheric, very just barely in this dimension, but enough that the camera got it. But we only saw the orb and heard the voices. Now there were several voices talking in the desert. Most people heard female. There was one male voice, which was this one. This is his chin, top of his head. This side is lit up. This is dark because the orb light energy source is to the left. Does that make sense? So these are around us all the time when we're doing the CE5 ambassador programs. Okay, next. Next. Yeah, there we go. So this is just this part of it cut out so you can see. And he's just hovering above the chairs here. Yeah. And this is more of another contrast to kind of clarify it. So when you see these beings moving around you, it's not always in 3D. Now they have been in 3D. It has happened that they have completely come into 3D and then dematerialized within seconds, where they actually, you can hear their foot's moving, steps moving around us. Some people don't like that. They get a little unnerved. I love it. But it's a learning and desensitization process too, to have closer and closer and closer encounters so that you're comfortable. This happened on the beach. Look at this. This is a still photograph. We actually saw this. This has happened more than once, where there's an ET energy field that comes in, wraps around this Peruvian doctor, and goes in. I call it the cosmic spermatozoa. It almost looks like a... But she's having a kundalini and cosmic consciousness experience while I'm guiding the meditation. And this comes into the group and wraps around her. Yeah. This happens all the time when we're sitting in meditation. But to get it on camera is really a virtuoso act of photography. Isn't that cool? Yeah. So Outer Banks is OBX. We're on the beach at National Seashore, and there's a highway. You'll see some headlights here. Hear the detector? Okay, so that starts happening, which we know is a signal they're about to arrive. And there's a ship that appears and dematerializes, rematerializes, and watch. Boom, beep, beep. It was huge. It lit up the ocean. It was orange, golden light, massive, and then it's gone. This is not a satellite. Watch, and now here's, yeah. The people have asked me, how many of these have you seen? I said several thousand. This is not a rare occurrence, but this is beautiful that we were able to photograph this. Watch, nothing there. So it came into this dimension, the signaling with the electronics, it lit up the ocean. Now watch this one. This is awesome. It keeps happening. And now watch what's going to happen the next one. Look at the angle it turns. No, and then it signals to us in dematerial. Do you see the angle? All right, these are not satellites or aircraft. But then, what's on the beach with us, making all the tones? And then, you know, is it when they're dematerialized, but they're moving around us, and we'll be in meditation, and they'll touch us on our right shoulder or top of our head. Amazing kinds of contact happen that are very unusual and not what people think. But again, why should they do what Steven Spielberg puts in a movie? They're not limited by Hollywood, remember that. Now we're in the crop circles last couple years ago, and we're doing our protocols late at night. This is great night photography. This is very pitch dark, and I had just done a puja, which is a Sanskrit ceremony, and this weird thing floats in over the crop circle and lights up the puja table. This is a detector that's on the table, but this is not. And no one had a blue light out there. And transdimensional objects from ET craft that come in, and this happens very, very close to us. This is one where we're in a crop circle during the daytime. This is my finger. And no one can see this, but I feel it in my heart and my mind. You know how dogs kind of pick up everything? I'm like a big dog. So, and this thing, I could feel him, this ship over here. And I point, and the camera person was astute enough to photograph where I was pointing and got this orb. Broad, this daytime, it's not a nighttime photo. That was right outside the edge of the crop circle field. If you were to pull that into full 3D, it would be a very large craft. I always tell the story of in Belgium there was a massive 800-foot diameter triangle that was fully materialized, but when it went away, what they left out of the report, the police report, it collapsed into an orb this size and then shot off into space, seen by all the military police, the gendarmes. Those things are left out. Now here we're up on Woodborough Hill, and this comes in. And it's this, it looks like the sun has risen, but it's over the field here. This is the east field where all the famous big, beautiful crop circles had appeared over the years. And this was a couple years ago. Magnificent. And you see people turning around trying to look at it. And sometimes it can come and light up so brightly that it lights up our circle like it's daytime. It almost looks like something mythical or mystical. But it's interstellar transdimensional manifestations. Now, we were training the French military to make contact, and this comes in. We're about to do the puja, the meditation, and that's me. And this weirdness happens. What is this? So everyone look, you see people looking, this thing flashed in with it almost looked like a multicolored purple thing, but the photograph of it was just this flattened disc-like thing hovering right over the field. Oh God, it's very bright. Look at that. Beautiful. These are the big ships really you hear about at Mount Shasta. It's like a star now. It's like one of these stars. Mm-hmm. Look how bright that is. So this is 14,200 feet high volcano. And out of these sheer size, we'll have these light ships come out. These emerge in and out of this, and it's in that sheer, you know, it's interesting they chose that area because that's so very steep. Yeah, you could never have a person there, you'd fall down. It's a glacier, and at one point we have 11 of these emerging out of the mountain interacting with us. You'll see a photo, and maybe in this series. I mean, we have thousands of these images, and we don't have all day here, but I'm just trying to give you the kind of things that happen on a routine basis when we're out doing the contact work. My sense is that this volcano is sort of like an interstellar base, just like Blanca Peak and up in Joshua Tree, where they come and go out of these sort of kind areas. Kind of crystalline caverns, and they're transdimensional ETs that have been in there for a long time. So watch this. This thing is right by the fence. We're at this farm. Mount Shasta's here. And this thing comes in and blips. It looks like someone's with a flashbulb camera, but there's nobody there. So now that seems very transient. And it is if you're only sticking with your 3D vision. But if you go into consciousness and see what was the source of that, you're going to then see what's actually hovering, shifted out of 3D. So you say, why don't they fully materialize and just come out and shake hands? Well, maybe it wouldn't be safe for them or us to do that. Look at the shape of this. It's beautiful. No, we're just putting in sort of an assortment of things in these so that you get a sense. So this happened on the coast of Florida a couple years ago. We were out there, and an object, these are visible with the naked eye. There are a bunch of them. They look like our CSETI triangle again. It's this motif that keeps continuing. And over the course of about an hour, there were 300 of these seen. And so we were sitting in circle, and it just kept going and going and going. It was like something in a children's movie for, you know, something celestial, but beautiful place on Marco Island. Okay, let's go to the next series. You can go to the next one. Here you go. So this is really cool. I have some land in Colorado, and this shot up right in front of our group from the land. You can see the trail of it. Zzz, boom, light ship. You see it? Yeah. Nobody was shooting off fireworks. And look at the stars, very clear. Fantastic image. Now, it's not fully 3D, but it's enough in this dimension you can get the sense of it. It had been in the field with us and was launching off, leaving. Then I went out there, and there's a tree where we put Sherry's ashes, and it was right after sunset, or right around there. And I said, there's a golden object shimmering in the field. And he took a picture, and here was the golden, kind of a golden ship that was partially in this dimension and partially not. This is unbelievable. This is, we're standing there doing our contact protocols with our hands outstretched, welcoming them, and this appears in thin air. A point, then this, and a light going up. Not an artifact. So it comes into this dimension. Everyone sees this, by the way. Beautiful. From another dimension and another star system. And when they vanish, they're inviting you to go into their dimension in consciousness and thought. If that makes sense. Okay, well, thank you. So that's the true story. Now, what Prince didn't know is that it was staged. It was what's called stagecraft. And I have a document from the 90s from the SSI, an organization that deals with Strategic Studies Institute is what it's called. And it talks about staging and hoaxing UFO events and abductions, it says the word, and mutilations for the purpose of scaring people so that it would create the psychological foundation for conflict in the future between Earth, humans, and these other civilizations. Now, I know this sounds terribly Machiavellian, and it is, but you have to consider, as a Pentagon person told me once, God help us that peace would break out. Because, well, I mean, you know, we're spending almost $1 trillion a year in the United States on military, homeland security, intelligence, et cetera, and so on. So you've got to keep some fires burning. So the whole global terrorism thing that's been manipulated to allow to get out of control, frankly, is to keep that fire burning until they can hit the button on the false flag interstellar. And it would fool almost everyone on planet Earth unless we wake up. So it's like the song from the 1970s, The Who, we won't be fooled again. Well, I think we were fooled again. 9/11 happened and we invaded Iraq. What a disaster. Now we have ISIS. So it's time for childhood's end here. And I'm going into this stuff not to kind of like scare people or be controversial, but I think that you need to know the truth about these things before we go on to what it means to become an ambassador to these civilizations. Otherwise, you're going to be taking all manner of baggage into your contact effort when you're out under the stars with your friends. So let's jettison the baggage and the disinfo packet, the disinformation packet, so that we get clarity on what this is. I don't speak of these things just to sort of put down any other person's research. I think most people are trying to report out what they're finding, but they don't know what the originating source of the finding is. For example, they don't know that EG&G and prior to that Siemens were building the implants that were being put into the people being abducted. They think they're from an interstellar civilization, which they are not. So this information is very explosive. People hate it when I speak about it because people like to have someone to hate. Now let's talk about that. Why is it that humans always want to find someone that they can vent otherness onto? Well, for a long time, I grew up in the 50s and 60s in the South. It was black people. I still remember having black and white water fountains in the late 50s and early 60s in North Carolina, where my father worked at a Sears store. Shocking. Then we had to hate someone else, some other culture, some other religion, gay people, whatever it is. You make up somebody that you can vent all of your hatred on and feel that you're better than they are. And where does this come from? Where does this original sin, if there is one, it's this divisiveness, come from? Well, if you study chimpanzees and other primates, which I have done, and Paris de Cuellar and a whole bunch of people who wanted to end the secrecy on this subject, but not in a way that was very conscious. And as an sort of result of this, and then the aftermath of it, something happened that shut that down. And when I had the meeting some years ago with Prince Hans-Adam von Liechtenstein, who's the Crown Prince of Liechtenstein, prior to a meeting with him, he had sent me a letter and said, Dr. Greer, you won't be able to do disclosure or contact, but not for reasons you think. I said, what? But I don't want to talk about it. I talked to him on the phone at his castle. But he says, well, I'm going to come to New York, let's meet. So we met. And what I discovered was that he and the other people who had been planning this in 1989, now remember this is over 25 years ago, didn't know that within the unacknowledged special access projects, which are the super secret projects that deal with this subject, not just in the US, but in Great Britain, Australia, all over. There's representation in every country, China, Russia. It's sort of its own transnational entity that kind of runs sub rosa and beneath the radar of normal governments. That there was a compartmented operation that had been practicing and had perfected the stagecraft of hoaxing contact. Now this is the part of the story that people do not like for me to tell, but you need to know it, and it's controversial, but it's essential if you're going to become someone who has clarity on this subject. Beginning in the late 40s and 50s, experiments began with electronic systems that led to the ability to alter awareness, but also to create life forms that look like aliens but are not. These are called program life forms. And by 1954, October, we had perfected electromagnetogravitics. What am I talking about? High voltage systems with certain resonant fields and certain specialized materials that allow for us to have lift. A UFO, man-made. So man-made UFOs, which began to be experimented with Werner von Braun and others for Adolf Hitler in the 40s, the OSS, that became the CIA through Operation Paperclip, brought those folks into our intelligence community and into our early aerospace program and created a whole parallel secret space program that did not involve rockets. So, I always tell people, if you're a rocket scientist, your knowledge is pretty much locked to 1940s. Everything that has been developed since then has been classified. Now, because of this, maybe we can turn off cell phones, thank you. Because of this, there became, as Eisenhower warned, a vast military-industrial complex that was so classified that eventually he lost control of it. And no president since Eisenhower has had operational control over all of these. What you find is that they do organize into troops and into war. And we are 98.5% identical to chimpanzees. So we have this proclivity that can be exploited by demagogues, whether it be religious demagogues, political demagogues, ufology demagogues, covert, majestic MJ-12, the group that was originally assembled to run the secret UFO programs, demagogues to turn one people against another, or, like the movie Independence Day, turn an entire civilization against another civilization. Why? Because in that conflict and fear, they can amass more and more centralized power. It's all about control and power. So how do we, it's like that song from In Vogue, free your mind, you know, it's like, you know, remember that song? You got to free your mind, honey, because here's the problem. If you pull all that into your paradigm, what you're going to do is simply replace one enemy for another. And that's what they have always wanted us to do. They've always had at the ready the next level of conflict, the next level of enemy. And the big one is not in Iraq or Tehran, it's out there that they're wanting to concoct. So I think we have to be very careful that we are not manipulated into this stupidity. Because if we are, we're going to get into the biggest catastrophe in human history, much worse than World War II. And I will remind you that no less a figure than General Douglas MacArthur in the well of the Congress in the 1950s, when he was leaving his post, said World War III will be interplanetary. So this xenophobia and fear-mongering and what have you began to be hatched about the time I was born in the mid-50s, and before many of you were alive. So we have to understand that the ability for a group that has trillions of dollars at their disposal to falsely inform people and to manipulate in a propagandist way, much like Hitler did against Jews and gypsies and gay people and socialists or whoever it was to justify the Holocaust, that psychological warfare propaganda was basically taken from the ashes of World War II and then reapplied to this subject, which pretty much explains most of what is known as retail ufology. And it's for this reason that, of course, I've always been the black sheep in that field. Because people do not, I mean, you know, it's like Gloria Steinem said, the truth will set you free, but first it will piss you off. So people, you know, always say, we just want to know the truth. And I'm going, well, I'm not so sure you do. But I'm going to share it anyway. Now, this is what I learned in the early 90s. I didn't know this until the early to mid 90s because I didn't have meetings with people who were read into, military speak is read into, or briefed at that level of compartmented intelligence, top secret SCI, special compartment intelligence. And I began to meet with not one. If I had heard this from one person, I would have dismissed it as crackpot.
Since 1995, over 26,000 international students from all walks of life join the British investigators' training courses in anomalous phenomena, the only courses of their kind, constructed by the world's leading academics and brilliant minds within ufology, paranormal and supernatural, parapsychological study, anomalous phenomena, science, hypnotherapy, spiritualism, astrology, astronomy, cryptozoology, and many other areas. Our certified self-study courses will teach you how to assess, analyze, engage, formulate, document, and be cognizant of all types of phenomena, suitable for light workers and starseeds, curious personalities and inquisitive minds, skeptics alike and truth seekers. For more information, please visit www.stellaruniversity.com.
Then, in October of 1973, I'm dating myself, I know, I was 18, I was up in the mountains of North Carolina, and I was sitting up by a fire tower up on Rich's Mountain at about 5,000 and some feet up in the Blue Ridge. And I was in deep meditation, and suddenly, after the meditation, I realized I wasn't alone. And there was I thought it was a deer that had beautiful almond-shaped eyes that was standing on its legs. I was an 18-year-old kid. I didn't know what this was. But it was an extraterrestrial life form. It touched me on my right shoulder, and all of my hair stood on end. Sort of like, and that's when I had a lot of hair. And it was this beautiful experience. And with that, I sort of like shifted out of space-time with this being in space with them. And it was in space. It was beautiful. And so began the experience of me using consciousness to make contact with these interstellar beings. And I began to experiment with it. So here I am, I'm an 18-year-old college student, and I'm experimenting with this, and every night that I do it, the National Park Service rangers and people are reporting UFOs being seen all over the area, and this big wave of UFOs start. And I realized that this really works, that you can go into quiet mind, remote view these civilizations wherever they are, using consciousness to see, set up a vector, like a landing vector if you're flying into LAX, that we do electronically, but you do this with thought, show them where we are, and ask them if they're able to come and interact with us. Now, they're not puppets on a string, but more often than not, something will happen. And so I didn't know what to do with this. I'm 18 years old, and I go, well, this is all very interesting, but kind of strange. And then I go on doing other things. And in 1990, I was basically visited and asked to start this entire effort, the CE5, Close Encounters of the Fifth Kind initiative. And the reason for it was that I later learned that there were a group of world leaders in November of 1989, including Papa Bush, these compartments. Now, by the time 1989 came around, there had been probably 100 generations of exponential development of those technologies. And as Ben Rich said, and as I'm sure you saw in the film, Sirius reported at a meeting that Jan Harzan from IBM was at that meeting, he's now the head of MUFON, that we basically had the technologies to take ET home. And that the way that communication happened is that it's like ESP, and every point in space and time is connected to every other point, which is, of course, what we've been saying for a long time. But the technologies that exist in these classified programs begin to be attached to an agenda to deceive people. Because here's what someone said to me in the early 90s as I was preparing to brief the director of the CIA. You hide it in plain sight. You hide everything in plain sight. It's all there. But you put a spin on it so that people are deceived. So it's either ridiculous or it's made to look kooky to keep it out of the mainstream media or academic circles, or it's something very frightening, so people don't want to approach it. They're terrified. And the added benefit of scaring people is that then you lay the foundation for what Wernher von Braun warned us about on his deathbed, that there was an agenda to stage an alien attack on Earth for the purpose of expanding the control of this military-industrial junta that is the biggest industry on the planet today, and seize more and more control through a false flag type operation like the Gulf of Tonkin in Vietnam, which, as you know, expanded the Vietnam War exponentially when we sort of hoaxed and staged the attack on our vessels in the Gulf of Tonkin in Vietnam. But this would be on a cosmic level. So beginning in the 50s and 60s, a plan was created to have events happen, controlled events, that would convince people that they were having experiences from ETs that were actually being done through what's called stagecraft from people. Now, Pérez de Cuellar didn't know this, the UN Secretary General, nor at that time did Papa Bush, the elder, not W, who was President of the United States in 1989, or Prince Hans Anna von Liechtenstein. But so what happened, and many of you may have heard of this through some of the work and research Bud Hopkins did, was that Pérez de Cuellar was abducted out of his limousine at 3 in the morning out of Midtown Manhattan. Of course, and he was told by the, quote, aliens to stop the disclosure effort, and that if he didn't, every world leader involved, including the President of the United States, would be abducted. And this blew up, I'm quoting from the Prince, like an atomic bomb in the Bush White House. The whole thing was shut down. Everything was shut down. So Gorbachev was involved, Papa Bush was involved, Pérez de Cuellar was involved, and Prince Hans von Liechtenstein. Now, I asked the Prince how he knew about this event that happened to Pérez de Cuellar. He says, because I'm very good friends with him and I was involved in this operation and knew about it when it happened.